Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a world before skyscrapers, before highways, before the sound of engines or electricity. Imagine a world where mountains were gods, where the sun had to be fed or it would die, where the stars were not distant burning balls of gas, but warriors, frozen in the sky, waiting for the end of days. This is the world of the Aztec. And before we call them that, before we give them the name history would remember, we must call them by their own name. They called themselves the Mexica, and their story does not begin in a golden city or a conquering army or a temple soaked in blood. No, their story begins with a whisper, a divine command, and a long, aching walk into the unknown. To understand who the Mexica were, you must first understand how they saw existence itself. To them, the universe was not stable. It was fragile. It had been created and destroyed 4 times before this world. 4 suns, each one snuffed out by cataclysm. There had been a sun of water, drowned by flood, a sun of wind, swept away by hurricane, a sun of fire, burned to nothing, a sun of darkness, consumed by jaguars. And now, in this 5th age, this 5th sun, the gods had sacrificed themselves at the city of Teotihuacan, throwing themselves into a great fire so that the new sun would rise and move across the sky. But the sun did not move on its own. It needed to be sustained. It needed blood. It needed human hearts, still beating, lifted to the heavens as offerings. Without this nourishment, the 5th sun would die, just like the 4 before it, and the world would end in earthquakes and darkness. This belief was not cruelty, it was cosmology. It was a people's understanding of their place in the universe, not as masters of the world, but as its caretakers, as the chosen ones, the ones responsible for keeping the sun alive. And the people charged most heavily with this sacred duty were the Mexica. Now, where did the Mexica come from? According to their own traditions, preserved in the painted books called codices and in the memories of their priests and historians, the Mexica came from a place called Aztlan. The name itself means something like place of herons or place of whiteness. Some imagined it as an island of reeds, white and gleaming, surrounded by blue water. A paradise, a homeland, a place the Mexica had left willingly or been cast out of, at the command of their god. That god was Huitzilopochtli. Say his name slowly, Huitzilopochtli. He was the god of the sun, the god of war. A hummingbird on the left, that is what his name means. He was the deity who spoke to the Mexica in dreams, in omens, through the mouths of priests. And it was Huitzilopochtli who commanded them to leave Aztlan and journey south, to wander, to struggle, to be hardened by the world until they were worthy of something greater. The date of this departure is placed by Mexica historians at around 1111 AD, though scholars debate this. What matters is not the exact year, but the image. A people packing up everything they owned, lifting their god's effigy onto the back of a priest, and walking away from everything they knew, into a continent that was already full of competing peoples, cities, and powers. The Mexica were, at this point in their history, nobody. They were a small, semi-nomadic group of people from the rugged northern frontier of Mesoamerica, a region the established peoples to the south called the Chichimex lands, barbarians' country. The Mexica had dark, calloused feet. They wore rough clothing. They spoke Nahuatl, a language of clicks and long vowels. They were hunters and foragers, skilled with the bow, tough and lean. And everywhere they went, nobody wanted them. As the Mexica wandered south through the decades and the generations, they arrived in the Valley of Mexico, a high mountain basin surrounded by volcanoes, dotted with lakes, already densely populated by sophisticated city-states. The Toltec civilization had once ruled this world, and its memory lived on as a golden age that every people in the region claimed to descend from. The great city of Tula had been the seat of Toltec power, and though it had collapsed centuries before, its legacy structured everything: art, religion, politics, identity. The valley the Mexica entered was dominated by a people called the Tepaneca, centered at a city called Azcapotzalco. There were also the Acolua at Texcoco, the Culhua at Culhuacan, and a dozen other smaller powers jostling for position around the shimmering lakes of the basin. The Mexica tried to settle. Again and again they were pushed away. Other peoples saw them as uncouth, aggressive, troublesome. Stories from this period describe the Mexica being driven out of settlement after settlement. At one point, they were hired as mercenaries by the Culhua and served admirably in war. The Culhua ruler gave the Mexica a piece of land, but it was deliberately chosen to be a snake-infested wasteland called Tizapan, in hopes that the serpents would kill them. Instead, the Mexica ate the snakes. In one terrible episode, so strange and horrible that it almost seems like myth, but may contain a kernel of historical truth, the Mexica asked the Culhua king for one of his daughters, claiming they wished to honor her as the bride of their god. The king agreed, but when he was invited to attend the ceremony, he arrived to find a priest wearing the flayed skin of his daughter. The Mexica intended this as the highest honor, to make her into a divine being, a living representation of a goddess. The king saw it as monstrous. He drove the Mexica out with an army. And so they wandered again. But Huitzilopochtli had promised them a sign. He had told his people that when they found an eagle perched on a cactus, eating a serpent, they would know they had found their home. They had carried this prophecy with them through every rejection, every war, every desperate generation. They would know the place when they saw it. And one day, around the year 1325 AD, a Mexica priest or scout, tradition does not agree on exactly who, looked out across the marshy islands of Lake Texcoco and saw it. The eagle, the cactus, the serpent, the sign. The place was uninviting. It was a small, swampy island, muddy and reedy, already partly occupied by birds and insects. There was no great forest, no fertile plain, just shallow water and mud and the cry of herons. But Huitzilopochtli had spoken, and the Mexica began to build. What the Mexica built on that muddy island would, within 2 centuries, become one of the largest cities on Earth. It would stun the Europeans who arrived on its shores in 1519. One Spanish soldier, a man named Bernal Diaz del Castillo, would write, and we will paraphrase him, that when he first saw the city rising from the water, he thought he was dreaming, that it seemed like something from the pages of a fantasy, that nothing in Spain, nothing in Europe, was like it. But in 1325, all of that glory was still 200 years away. In 1325, the Mexica were still struggling, still building on borrowed hope, still watched with suspicion by their neighbors. They began by doing what the peoples of this region had done for centuries. They built chinampas. These were extraordinary agricultural structures, long, rectangular plots of land constructed in the shallow lake by layering mud, vegetation, and organic matter on top of reed mats anchored to the lake floor. Over time, the roots of plants would grow down into the lake bed, stabilizing the plots. the Chinampas created extraordinarily fertile ground. Several harvests per year were possible. Food could be grown in the lake itself. The Mexica expanded their island through this technique. They dredged mud. They wove reeds. They pushed the edges of their territory outward into the water, season by season, year by year. Slowly, the island grew. They also built their first great temple, a modest structure at first, a small pyramid of earth and stone, dedicated to Huitzilopochtli. This temple, repeatedly rebuilt and enlarged, would one day become the Templo Mayor, the great double pyramid at the heart of their empire, the axis around which the Mexica world revolved. Now, the Mexica were not alone in the lake. There was a sister community that had settled nearby around the same time on an adjacent island called Tlatelolco. The relationship between Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco was complicated from the start. They were kin, but rivals. Tlatelolco would eventually develop into the great marketplace hub of the empire, a place so vast and varied that it would leave Spanish visitors speechless. But for now, both communities were simply trying to survive. And survival meant politics. The Mexica needed a king. Not because they had always had one. In fact, for much of their wandering, they had been governed by priests and councils. But because to be taken seriously in the political world of the Valley of Mexico, you needed to have a royal lineage. You needed to claim Toltec blood. You needed to play by the rules of the world you had entered. And so, the Mexica reached out to the Culhua, the very people who had driven them out in rage, and asked for a royal prince. The king of Culhuacan sent a prince named Acamapichtli, a man of Toltec lineage, and in approximately 1376 A.D., Acamapichtli became the first Tlatoani, the first speaker, the first king of Tenochtitlan. This was a masterstroke of political thinking. By marrying their ruling class into the Toltec bloodline, the Mexica gained the legitimacy they had always lacked. They were no longer wandering barbarians. They were the heirs of the great Toltec tradition. But they were still weak, and they were still under the thumb of the dominant power in the valley, the Tepaneca of Azcapotzalco. For roughly 40 years, the Mexica served the Tepaneca as tributaries. They paid in fish and frogs and ducks and reeds, the humble products of their lake. They fought in Tepanec wars as soldiers and were rewarded with a share of the spoils. They learned, they watched, they built. 3 kings, Acamapichtli, his son Huitzilopochtli, and then Chimalpopoca, ruled Tenochtitlan through this period of subordination. Relations with the Tepanec lord Tezozomoc were carefully managed. Tezozomoc was a formidable ruler, aged and cunning, who had spent his long life expanding Tepanec dominance over the entire valley. He was one of those historical figures who seems larger than human, patient, brilliant, ruthless. Under him, even the great city of Texcoco was humbled. When Tezozomoc died, however, everything changed. His son Maxtla seized power in a brutal purge, killing rivals including, allegedly, the young Mexica king Chimalpopoca. Whether Chimalpopoca was assassinated by Maxtla or died by his own hand rather than submit is debated. But the effect was the same. Tenochtitlan was in crisis, and in the wider valley, a resistance was forming. The new Mexica king was a man named Itzcoatl, Obsidian Serpent. And beside him stood one of the most remarkable and underappreciated political architects in the history of the ancient world, a man named Tlacaelel. Tlacaelel was Itzcoatl's half-brother. He was not a king, and he may never have wanted to be. What he was a Chihuacoatl, a kind of prime minister, a chief counselor, a man who whispered in the ear of power and shaped the destiny of an empire. He would serve 3 kings across more than 50 years, and his fingerprints are on everything that defined the Aztec world as we know it. It was Tlacaelel, tradition tells us, who convinced Itzcoatl to join forces with the exiled lord of Texcoco, a brilliant young man named Nezahualcoyotl, and with the smaller city of Tlacopan to form an alliance against Maxtla and the Tepaneca. The 3 cities, Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, Tlacopan, came together in what history calls the Triple Alliance. In 1428, they went to war. The war was hard. There were moments of doubt. Mexica warriors who feared defeat offered to submit to slavery if the alliance failed. Itzcoatl and Tlacaelel refused to entertain the possibility of defeat. They fought, and they won. Azcapotzalco, the great Tepanec capital, was taken. Maxtla was captured, and in a grim ritual, he was sacrificed by Nezahualcoyotl, the very man whose father Maxtla had murdered. The empire of the Tepaneca was broken, and into the power vacuum stepped the Triple Alliance. Now comes the moment that shapes everything that follows, a moment that Tlacaelel orchestrated with the cold precision of a man who understood that history belongs to those who write it. According to later Mexica tradition, Tlacaelel ordered the burning of the painted books. The historical records of other peoples, and even of the Mexica's own humble past. The chronicles of their wandering, their servitude, their insignificance. Why? Because Tlacaelel intended to write a new history. A history in which the Mexica were not refugees or vagabonds or tribute payers. A history in which the Mexica were the chosen people of the sun, the people destined to rule, the people without whom the universe itself would collapse. It was perhaps the most audacious act of state propaganda in the ancient world. And it worked. Let us take a breath here and think about what the Aztec world looked like as the empire began to grow. Mesoamerica in the early 15th century was not an empty land. It was extraordinarily dense with cultures, languages, and histories. The Mixtec people produced some of the most beautiful goldwork and painted manuscripts in the ancient world. The Totonac people of the Gulf Coast maintained elaborate religious traditions and magnificent cities. The Zapotec of Oaxaca had built Monte Alban centuries before and maintained a sophisticated civilization. The Maya, whose classic era had ended long ago, still populated the Yucatan Peninsula and the highlands of Guatemala with vibrant communities. The Valley of Mexico itself was home to dozens of city-states, each with its own king, its own patron deity, its own army. This was a world of constant diplomacy and war, of shifting alliances and blood feuds, of trade routes and tribute demands. Into this world, the newly powerful Triple Alliance projected itself with extraordinary force. The engine of Aztec expansion was war. But Aztec war was not always what we might imagine. It was not always a war of annihilation or conquest in the European sense. Often, especially in the early imperial period, it followed a formalized pattern with its own rules and purposes. When the Aztecs wished to bring a city-state into the empire, they first sent merchants, the Pochteca, and they sent envoys. They offered terms. They said, "Acknowledge our supremacy, pay tribute, and we will leave you in peace. Your king can remain. Your gods can remain. Your people can remain. Simply send us goods, soldiers when we call, and honor our authority." Many cities accepted. The Aztec tribute system was demanding, but not necessarily ruinous. A city that submitted could continue to exist largely as before, simply sending a portion of its wealth, cloth, food, feathers, jade, cacao, gold, to Tenochtitlan on a regular schedule. But not all cities submitted willingly, and this is where war came in. The Aztec military was formidable. Its warriors were organized into elite orders. The Eagle warriors and the Jaguar warriors were the most celebrated, fighters who had proven themselves in combat and who wore magnificent regalia. The Eagle warriors dressed in feathered helmets shaped like the heads of great birds, and the Jaguar warriors wearing the spotted skins of the animal that prowled the jungle and represented the night sky. These were not merely soldiers, they were symbols, living manifestations of divine power. Aztec warfare prioritized the capture of prisoners over the killing of enemies. This was not weakness or inefficiency, it was theology. Prisoners were needed for sacrifice. The gods required blood, and the blood of captured warriors was particularly potent. A warrior who took many captives in battle was elevated in status, showered with honors, given privileges denied to ordinary men. A warrior who died in battle was promised a glorious afterlife. To be reborn as a hummingbird or a butterfly, to fly through fields of flowers forever. And this is where we must speak about something that is perhaps the most confronting aspect of Aztec civilization to modern sensibilities: human sacrifice. It was real, it was large-scale, and it was central to everything. The Aztecs sacrificed human beings at their temples with regularity. The most common form involved a living person being laid across a sacrificial stone, held down by 4 priests, while a 5th used an obsidian or flint knife to cut open the chest and extract the still beating heart. The heart was held up to the sun, an offering to keep that celestial fire burning. The body was often then rolled down the temple steps. Different gods required different forms of sacrifice: drowning for rain gods, burning, flaying. The scale of this practice grew enormously as the empire expanded. At the dedication of the enlarged Templo Mayor in 1487, which we will return to in more detail, tradition records that thousands of captives were sacrificed over several days. Modern scholars debate the exact numbers, and some argue the Aztec sources themselves may have inflated the figures for propaganda purposes. But the practice was real, documented, and defines the Aztec world in ways that cannot be softened or explained away. Yet we must be careful about how we hold this knowledge. The Aztecs lived in a moral universe radically different from our own, one in which the sacrifice of human life was not murder, but liturgy, not cruelty, but cosmic necessity. The person who died on the altar was not simply killed, they were transformed. They became divine. They joined the sun. In a world where the alternative was the death of the sun and the destruction of all life on Earth, the sacrifice of a few seemed not just reasonable, but heroic. This does not make it right by our standards, but it helps us understand why a civilization capable of such extraordinary beauty, such poetry and astronomy and art and architecture, was also capable of this. Now, one of the most fascinating military innovations of the Aztec period was something scholars call the Flower Wars. In Nahuatl, the Xochiaoyotl. The Flower Wars were a unique form of ritualized conflict between the Aztecs and their long-standing adversaries to the east, principally the Tlaxcalans, the people of Tlaxcala, along with the Huexotzinca and the Cholulteca. These were powerful peoples who had refused to submit to Aztec authority and who maintained their independence in a rugged highland region that gave them considerable defensive advantage. Rather than attempting full-scale conquest, which proved difficult and costly, the Aztecs and these rival states entered into an arrangement whereby they would meet on agreed battlefields at agreed times and fight for the purpose of taking prisoners for sacrifice. It was war as ritual, war as harvest. Both sides participated. Both sides took prisoners, and the relationship persisted for decades. There are scholars who argue the Flower Wars were not truly formalized agreements, but simply the name given to a cycle of warfare that neither side could decisively win. Whatever their exact nature, they had a consequence that would prove fatal. The Tlaxcalans did not become Aztec subjects. They nursed their grievances. They remembered every humiliation. And when the Spanish arrived, the Tlaxcalans would remember all of it. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In the reign of Huitzilopochtli, and through the long, remarkable career of Tlacaelel, the empire took its fundamental shape. The tribute system was organized. The social hierarchy was codified. The religious calendar, extraordinarily complex, interweaving a 365-day solar year with a 260-day ritual calendar that cycled against each other in a great 52-year round, was maintained by a class of priests whose learning rivaled any in the world. When Huitzilopochtli died in 1440, he was succeeded by a man who would become one of the greatest rulers the Mexica ever produced, Moctezuma I, or, to use his full honorific, Moctezuma Ilhuicamina, he who frowns like a lord, or he who pierces the sky with an arrow. Moctezuma I ruled for nearly 3 decades. Under him, the Triple Alliance expanded dramatically southward and eastward. Campaigns pushed into the Gulf Coast, into Oaxaca, into the rich lowland regions where cotton and cacao and tropical feathers flowed. The tribute system grew enormously wealthy. He also faced a catastrophe that tested the empire's foundations, a famine. For 4 years in the late 1450s, the harvests failed. The cold and the frosts came too early. Millions faced starvation. The lakes that had nurtured Tenochtitlan offered some buffer, but throughout the empire, people sold themselves and their children into slavery in exchange for food from wealthier regions to the south. The famine passed, but it left a mark, and for Tlacaelel, it confirmed what he already believed, that the gods were hungry, that the sacrifices must increase, that the empire must expand, not just for wealth and power, but to feed the cosmic machinery that kept the world alive. When Moctezuma I died in 1469, Tlacaelel still lived, that extraordinary architect of empire. He refused the throne when it was offered to him, tradition says. He preferred to remain the power behind it. And so, the kingship passed to another, and then another, while Tlacaelel watched. He would live until around 1480. He had served since the 1420s, 60 years of steering the most powerful state in Mesoamerica. When he finally died, he left behind an empire, an ideology, and a people who believed with total conviction that they were the children of the sun, and that the sun could not survive without them. Let us stop the march of kings and wars for a moment. Let us stand still. Let us look at the city. Because if you are going to understand the Aztec civilization, truly understand it in your bones, you have to understand Tenochtitlan. You have to walk its streets in your imagination and feel what it was. By the early 16th century, Tenochtitlan covered approximately 13 square kilometers of island and reclaimed land in Lake Texcoco. Its population has been estimated at anywhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people, making it one of the largest cities on Earth at the time, comparable to or larger than London, Paris, or Constantinople. The city was organized along cardinal directions with a precision that reflected its cosmological purpose. 4 great causeways connected the island to the mainland, running north, south, east, and west. These causeways were so wide that 10 horsemen could ride abreast on them, or so the Spaniards would later note in astonishment. They were fitted with removable bridges that could be lifted to isolate the island in case of attack. Canals ran through the city like blood vessels. The Mexica had no draft animals, no horses, no oxen, and so the canals were their highways. Thousands of canoes moved through them daily, carrying food and goods and people. Bernal Diaz, that Spanish soldier who would one day see it all, described watching the lake covered in canoes like a forest of boats. At the heart of the city stood the sacred precinct, a walled compound, roughly 400 meters on each side, containing dozens of temples, schools, ball courts, and ceremonial structures. At its center, looming over everything, was the Templo Mayor. The Templo Mayor was a double pyramid with 2 stairways leading to 2 shrines at its summit, one dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, and one to Tlaloc, the ancient god of rain and water. This pairing was deeply intentional. It married the 2 essential forces of Mexica life, conquest and agriculture, blood and rain. The pyramid had been rebuilt and enlarged multiple times, each new king adding another layer over the last, like an ever-growing shell. By the time the Spanish arrived, the Templo Mayor towered approximately 60 meters into the sky. From its summit, on a clear day, you could see the entire valley, the glittering lakes, the surrounding mountains, the 100 towns and cities of the empire. Around the Templo Mayor stood the temple of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, one of the oldest gods of Mesoamerica, built in a circular form, unusual in a world of squares and rectangles. There was a temple to the sun, a skull rack, the Tzompantli, where thousands of the skulls of sacrificial victims were displayed on poles, their eye sockets facing outward, a wall of death and devotion visible to all who entered the sacred precinct. Archaeologists working in modern Mexico City have found these skull towers, and they are exactly as described. Immense, meticulously constructed, and deeply disturbing to our modern eyes. But Tenochtitlan was not only a city of temples and sacrifice. Step outside the sacred precinct, and you entered a city that was, by any measure, a wonder of urban planning. The streets were kept clean, remarkably so. Spanish witnesses would comment that the roads of Tenochtitlan were cleaner than those of any city in Spain. Thousands of workers swept the streets daily. Human waste was collected and used as fertilizer on the chinampas. Waste disposal was organized and functional. There were markets. Oh, the markets. The great market of Tlatelolco, the sister city, now absorbed into the greater metropolitan area of Tenochtitlan, was described by Hernán Cortés himself in a letter to the Spanish king, that he had seen nothing to equal it in all of Spain or the rest of Europe. He wrote of merchants selling gold, silver, and precious stones, of feathers from birds of every color, of cloth and embroidery, of cacao beans used as currency, of food stalls selling every kind of maize preparation, tortillas, tamales, porridge, of pottery and wooden tools and rubber balls, of medicinal herbs laid out in careful rows, tended by men who knew their properties the way a pharmacist knows his compounds, of barbers and their customers, of scribes who read and wrote documents for those who could not, of sellers of tobacco, of live animals, of building materials. Estimates suggest the Tlatelolco market attracted up to 60,000 people on busy days. There were judges who walked the market to settle disputes about prices or quality. There were designated areas for every category of goods. It was regulated, organized, sophisticated. And the food. The Aztec diet was extraordinary in its variety and ingenuity. Maize, corn, was the foundation of everything, ground into flour and shaped into the infinite varieties of tortilla and tamale. But alongside it, squash and beans, which together with corn formed the Three Sisters, a trio of companion plants that had fed Mesoamerica for thousands of years. Tomatoes, avocados, chili peppers, sweet potatoes, vanilla. chocolate, xocolotl, consumed as a bitter, foamy, spiced drink by the nobility, mixed with water and chili and flavored with honey or flowers. The Aztec nobility ate from elaborate ceramic dishes. They sat on reed mats and low thrones. After meals, they smoked tobacco in clay pipes. They were served by attendants. They listened to music, flutes and drums and the resonant voices of singers. And they watched dances performed by trained performers. Their palaces were built around interior courtyards filled with gardens, fountains, and aviaries where rare birds from across the empire were kept. The palace of Moctezuma II, whom we will meet soon, was said to be enormous. Spanish witnesses described rooms beyond counting, vast courtyards, separate quarters for the royal women, libraries of painted books, a zoo with animals from across Mesoamerica, jaguars, pumas, eagles, serpents, a white albino alligator, cared for by hundreds of keepers. There was an armory, a treasury, a hall of physical curiosities. By the estimates of Spanish observers, 300 men were employed just to bring the king his daily meals. Now, who were the people of this city? Aztec society was hierarchical but not immovable. At the top was the Tlatoani, the king, whose authority was both political and divine. He was the representative of Huitzilopochtli on earth. He was carried in a litter so that his feet would not touch the ground. When he walked among his subjects, they bowed their eyes. His garments were of the finest cotton and quetzal feathers. He was decorated with jade and obsidian, gold and turquoise. Beneath the king was the nobility, the Pipiltin. These were men and women of recognized lineage, educated in special schools called Kalmakak, where they learned not only the arts of war, but astronomy, history, rhetoric, and theology. The Kalmakak produced the priests, the judges, the generals, the governors. Then came the common people, the Mekahwaltin. Commoners had their own civic organization through the Kalpuli, neighborhood units that owned land communally, organized labor, maintained local temples, and sent their sons to their own schools. The Telpochkali, where young men were trained as warriors and citizens. Below the commoners were the Mayeke, tenant farmers who worked land they did not own, and at the bottom, the Tlacotli, slaves. Slavery among the Aztecs was different from the chattel slavery of the Atlantic world. Slaves could own property. They could buy their freedom. Their children were born free. A person could become a slave through debt, through crime, or through capture in war. Slavery was a legal status, not a permanent heritable condition. Women in Aztec society occupied a complex position. They could own property. They could run businesses. They were celebrated for skill in weaving, a sacred and status-laden craft, and for their roles as mothers and educators. Yet, they were excluded from the priesthood at the highest levels, from military service, and from political power in most forms. The goddess Tzihuacoatl, woman serpent, was honored deeply, and women who died in childbirth were accorded warrior status, believed to join the sun. But the political and military world belonged overwhelmingly to men. Education was universal in a remarkable way. All children, male and female, noble and commoner, were required to attend school. This was unusual in the ancient world. The Aztecs believed in an educated populace, trained not just in practical skills, but in the songs, poems, prayers, and histories that held society together. And the arts of Tenochtitlan were breathtaking. The stone sculpture that survives from the Aztec period is among the most powerful art ever created. The Great Calendar Stone, often called the Aztec Sunstone, is not a calendar in the way we use the word. but a cosmological monument. A massive basalt disk showing the face of the sun god at its center, surrounded by the 4 previous suns, surrounded by the symbols of the 20 days of the Aztec ritual month, surrounded by the 2 great fire serpents that frame the cosmos. It weighs nearly 24 tons and was once painted in vivid colors. It was not meant to be seen by commoners. It was a monument for the gods. The featherwork of Aztec artisans was so fine it reduced European observers to silence. Elaborate mosaics of tiny feathers, from hummingbirds, from parrots, from the sacred quetzal, were assembled into cloaks, shields, headdresses, and fans of staggering beauty. Most of this work has perished. A handful of pieces survive in European museums, brought back by the Spaniards as curiosities. They are luminous, shimmering, impossible seeming, the work of hands guided by a tradition of perfection. Aztec poetry, their song and verse, survives in transcriptions made after the conquest. The poets, called Tlamatinime, meaning those who know something, wrote about flowers and war, about death and longing, about the fragility of beauty. One poem, attributed to the great Nezahualcóyotl, the poet king of Texcoco, asks whether anything on earth is truly permanent, whether the flowers and songs we create will outlast us. The answer the poet offers is both sad and defiant. Only art endures. Only beauty remembers. This was the world, this luminous, terrible, magnificent world, built on a lake, built on blood, built on the faith that the sun would not rise again unless someone fed it. And now, into that world, a shadow was falling. Before we meet the man who would be there when the world ended, we must first meet the man who brought it to its greatest height. His name was Huitzilopochtli, and he was, by almost any measure, the most fearsome military commander in Aztec history. He came to power in 1486, the 8th Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan, and he wasted no time. Where previous kings had expanded the empire steadily, Huitzilopochtli expanded it explosively. Campaign after campaign pushed Aztec power into regions that had never felt its grip. Deep into Oaxaca, along both coasts, far south into what is now Guatemala, and northwest toward the arid frontier. Under Huitzilopochtli, the Triple Alliance reached its greatest territorial extent, an empire of somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 square kilometers, encompassing perhaps 5 to 6 million people paying tribute. The event that defines Huitzilopochtli's reign in the historical memory is the dedication of the rebuilt Templo Mayor in 1487. The Great Pyramid had been expanded to its largest and most magnificent form, and Huitzilopochtli marked its completion with a ceremony that shook the entire world of Mesoamerica. Prisoners of war, gathered from years of campaigns specifically for this purpose, were brought to Tenochtitlan from every corner of the empire. They came in long columns, painted, adorned, some drugged or stupefied, others, it is said, walking with strange composure to their fate. At the top of the Templo Mayor, at both its shrines, the sacrifices began. The numbers recorded in Aztec sources range from around 4,000 to as many as 80,000 over the course of 4 days. Modern scholars believe the higher figures are inflated, likely for political and religious propaganda purposes, and that the real number was perhaps in the thousands. Even at the lowest credible estimates, it represents the largest single sacrificial event in recorded Mesoamerican history. The ceremony was witnessed by representatives from allied and rival states alike. They were invited, compelled, to attend, to see, to understand who held power and what that power meant. Kings and lords from Tlaxcala, from Huexotzinco, from Michoacán, the great western rival state of the Tarascan Empire, who had never submitted to Aztec power, were brought to Tenochtitlan disguised, in secret, so they could witness the ceremony without the humiliation of being seen to attend. The message Huitzilopochtli was sending to the world was unmistakable. This is our God. This is our city. This is our power. And it is beyond anything you can imagine. Huitzilopochtli also faced the challenge of Tenochtitlan's growth. The city needed more water than the existing aqueducts could provide. He ordered the construction of a new aqueduct to bring fresh water from springs at Coyoacan on the southern shore. When the project was completed and the water was turned on, it flowed so powerfully that parts of the city flooded. The damage was significant. Huitzilopochtli himself, according to some accounts, was injured when he struck his head fleeing the rising waters. He never fully recovered. He died in 1502. His death was mourned with elaborate ceremony. His body was cremated, as was the custom for kings, with his treasures and the sacrificed companions who would serve him in the afterlife. His memory was honored. And then, the empire looked for its next speaker. The succession process among the Aztecs was not simple hereditary monarchy, not eldest son to eldest son. The new king was chosen by a council of nobles from among the eligible candidates of the royal lineage. The choice fell on a man in his 30s, educated at the Kalmakak, trained in war and theology, known for his seriousness and his religious devotion. His name was Moctezuma II, Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, Moctezuma the Younger. And it would fall to him to face the impossible. Moctezuma II took the throne of Tenochtitlan in 1502 and immediately made clear what kind of ruler he would be. One of his first acts was to purge the palace of all the servants and courtiers who had served under Huitzilopochtli, replacing them with men of his own choosing. He insisted on an extreme formalization of court etiquette, the distance that must be maintained from his person, the manner in which one must approach and address him, the elaborate protocols of gift-giving and ritual obeisance. He was deeply, almost obsessively religious. He spent long hours in fasting and prayer, cutting himself with maguey spines as penance, consulting the omens and the priests. He was also a sophisticated political thinker and military commander. In the early years of his reign, he conducted successful campaigns that expanded and consolidated Aztec power. He was not weak, he was not foolish. He was a man of his world, perhaps too much of his world, because the world Moctezuma inhabited was one saturated with omens and prophecy, and in the years before the Spanish arrival, the omens turned dark. 8 ill portents are recorded in Aztec historical sources, compiled after the conquest, which means we must hold them with some caution, since they may have been shaped by hindsight. But the cultural context that produced them is real. There was a comet seen in the sky, burning and trembling, something described as a flaming ear of corn, raining fire on the earth. The temple of Huitzilopochtli caught fire spontaneously and could not be extinguished by water. Another temple was struck by lightning from a clear sky. A strange bird was brought to Moctezuma, described as having a mirror-like surface on its head in which the king could see warriors charging on deer. Deformed children were born and then vanished. Weeping was heard at night. A woman crying for her children, crying that she must leave them behind. Whether these events literally occurred, they point to a palpable anxiety in the Aztec world of the early 16th century. Things were not right. The priests were troubled. The sacrifices seemed insufficient. The gods seemed restless. And then there was the prophecy. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, was one of the oldest and most complex figures in Mesoamerican religion. He was the god of wind and learning, of the morning star, of creation. Among the Toltecs, he had been associated with a legendary priest-king, also called Quetzalcoatl, a figure of great wisdom who, according to tradition, had been driven out by dark forces, had sailed east across the sea, and had promised to return. In the Aztec calendar, the year one reed, Say-a-catl, was his year, and one reed fell in 1519, the year the Spanish arrived. Now, scholars debate extensively whether the Quetzalcoatl prophecy was truly a major factor in Moctezuma's initial response to the Spanish, or whether this connection was constructed after the fact, a story the Aztecs and the Spanish both found useful. The full story is more complicated and more human than a simple prophecy fulfillment narrative. But what is clear is that Moctezuma and the Aztec world around him was already primed for apocalyptic anxiety. The machinery of their cosmology was geared toward endings. They knew the fifth sun would one day die. They lived with that knowledge every day. When news arrived in Tenochtitlan that strange beings had appeared on the eastern coast, beings with pale skin and facial hair, riding enormous animals, carrying weapons that spoke with thunder and fire, arriving in vast houses that moved across the water. It landed in a world already trembling with dread. Moctezuma did what any ruler in his position would do. He sent envoys. He sent gifts, extraordinary gifts, the sacred regalia of gods, garments of quetzal feathers and gold and obsidian, in part as a political gesture, but also, possibly, as a test. To see how these strangers responded, to understand what they were. He also sent sorcerers and magicians to neutralize the strangers through spiritual means. They failed. He sent orders to the coast to monitor and observe. He considered blocking their advance. He consulted his priests and his advisors. Some counseled aggression. Some counseled diplomacy. Moctezuma appears to have been paralyzed, not, as the old narrative claimed, because he was convinced the Spaniards were gods, but because he faced an enemy he could not categorize. An enemy outside his world's framework. An enemy whose intentions and capabilities were entirely unknown. And while he hesitated, Hernán Cortés marched toward him. Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico in the spring of 1519 with an expedition of roughly 500 soldiers, a handful of horses, a few cannons, and a determination that bordered on madness. He had come without proper authorization from the governor of Cuba, who had revoked his commission at the last moment, a fact that made Cortés not just an explorer, but a mutineer who had to justify everything he did. His first great stroke of luck, or destiny, depending on how you see it, was acquiring interpreters. The first was a Spaniard named Geronimo de Aguilar, who had been shipwrecked on the Yucatan coast years earlier and had lived among the Maya, learning their language. The second was a young Nahuatl-speaking woman who the Spanish called Marina, or Doña Marina, and whom history knows by her Nahuatl name, Malintzin, or in the popular tradition, La Malinche. She had been born into a noble family, sold into slavery, given as a gift to the Spanish. She spoke Nahuatl and Maya, and through Aguilar's Spanish, a chain of translation was established. She learned Spanish with astonishing speed, and within months was serving as direct interpreter. Malintzin was indispensable. Without her, there is no conquest of Mexico. She translated not just words, but intentions, not just language, but culture. She was Cortés's voice and his ears. She was also, inevitably, a deeply tragic figure. A woman whose collaboration with the conquerors of her people has made her, in later Mexican history, both a symbol of betrayal and a symbol of survival. The truth of who she was and what she chose is more complex than either reading allows. As Cortés moved along the Gulf Coast, establishing a base at Veracruz, he encountered something that electrified him, evidence of unrest within the Aztec Empire. The Totonac people of the Gulf Coast, who had been under Aztec domination for decades, were chafing under tribute demands. Cortés cultivated their leaders, presented himself as a liberator, and when Aztec tribute collectors arrived, he arrested them, then secretly released them and sent them back to Moctezuma with a message of friendship. A calculated display of power and diplomacy simultaneously. He then did something extraordinary. He burned his ships. The historical record is somewhat ambiguous on whether Cortés truly burned them or merely had them run aground and stripped, but the effect was the same. His men could not retreat. They would advance or they would die. It was a statement of total commitment that welded his army into a single desperate organism. And then he marched into the mountains. The journey from the coast to Tenochtitlan covered roughly 400 kilometers through terrain that ranges from humid jungle lowland to high volcanic plateau. Cortés moved through it, meeting both allies and enemies. The Tlaxcalans were the defining encounter. The Tlaxcalans, the people who had maintained their independence against the Aztecs through decades of flower wars, were not about to simply welcome a new set of conquerors. When Cortés entered their territory, they fought him hard. Several battles were waged in which the Spanish suffered real losses, and in which the limitations of European technology were tested against the fierce fighters of Tlaxcala. The Tlaxcalans discovered that the Spaniards were mortal. They bled. They died. But they also did not stop. The Tlaxcalan commanders concluded, with political intelligence, that these foreigners might be more useful as allies than as enemies. An alliance with Cortés could be the weapon they needed to finally break free of the Aztec yoke. The Tlaxcalans allied with Cortés. Tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors would eventually join the Spanish force. This is perhaps the most important fact of the conquest that popular history overlooks. The army that destroyed the Aztec Empire was not a Spanish army. It was a coalition army, overwhelmingly composed of indigenous peoples who had their own reasons, old hatreds, old grievances, old dreams of freedom, for wanting the Aztecs gone. Cortés received an invitation from Moctezuma. Come to Tenochtitlan. Be welcomed. His advisors warned him it might be a trap. The priests of Tlaxcala warned him. His own instincts as a military man must have whispered caution. An island city, connected to the mainland only by causeways that could be cut. Entering such a place with 500 soldiers and even tens of thousands of indigenous allies was a profound vulnerability. He went anyway. On the 8th of November, 1519, the Spanish and their allies approached Tenochtitlan along the Great Southern Causeway. The morning was cold and clear. The volcanic peaks of Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, their Aztec names meaning Smoking Mountain and White Woman, stood white with snow against the blue sky. And then the city rose from the lake. Bernal Diaz, who was there, writing decades later, tried to capture that moment. He wrote that they gazed upon things never before seen, things never before dreamed, and that they did not know how to describe them. Great towers, pyramids, and buildings rising from the water. The lake covered with canoes. The causeway so thronged with people that there was barely room to move. Moctezuma came out to meet them. He was carried in a litter by nobles. A canopy of green quetzal feathers, gold, silver, and pearls was held above him. He wore sandals with golden soles that touched the ground. The lords who accompanied him swept the ground before his feet. No one looked him in the eye. Cortés dismounted. He walked toward the king. He tried to embrace him. The lords intervened. The emperor was not to be touched. They exchanged garlands. Moctezuma gave Cortés a necklace of golden crabs and shrimp. Cortés draped a necklace of colored glass beads around the emperor's neck. Two worlds, pressing their faces against the glass of each other's reality. Moctezuma spoke through interpreters. He said, or tradition records him as saying, something to the effect that he had been told of your coming for a long time. That you have come from where the sun rises, that you have come to sit upon your throne, to return to your land. Scholars debate endlessly what Moctezuma actually meant by this. Was he invoking the Quetzalcoatl narrative, employing a diplomatic fiction, testing the newcomers, surrendering? The words may have been edited in the translation through Malintzin, or in the Spanish rendering, or in the later recording of Aztec memory. We will never know exactly what was said that day. What we know is that Cortés and his army were welcomed into Tenochtitlan. They were housed in the palace of Moctezuma's father. They saw the city. They visited the great market, the Templo Mayor, the royal zoo. They gaped. They calculated. They prayed. And within a week, Cortés had made his decision. He took Moctezuma prisoner. The seizure of Moctezuma was audacious beyond measure. Cortés, with a small group of soldiers, confronted the emperor and essentially told him that for his own safety, he must come and reside in the Spanish quarters. The precise dynamics of this moment, how much force was implied, how much was negotiation, whether Moctezuma went willingly or under threat, is again disputed. What is clear is that Moctezuma went, and that the Aztec world was faced with an unprecedented situation for which its political culture had no playbook. The God King had been removed from his palace. The sun feeder, the axis of the cosmos, was in the hands of strangers. For weeks and then months, a strange equilibrium held. Moctezuma continued to conduct some functions of governance from captivity. He received visitors. He ate well. Cortés treated him with elaborate external respect while holding him in a gilded cage. The Spanish rummaged through the royal treasury, marveling at the gold and jade and featherwork they found. Soldiers melted down irreplaceable works of art into bars. But the equilibrium could not hold forever. There were voices among the Aztec nobility and military demanding action, demanding that the strangers be expelled or destroyed. The Spanish were vastly outnumbered in a city designed to trap invaders by pulling up the causeways. Then, a new crisis erupted from an unexpected direction. A Spanish fleet arrived on the Gulf Coast, sent by the governor of Cuba to arrest Cortés for his unauthorized expedition. Cortés was forced to leave Tenochtitlan with most of his army to deal with this threat, leaving a garrison under the command of a man named Pedro de Alvarado. Alvarado was a soldier of ferocious courage and catastrophically poor judgment. During a great religious festival, the Festival of Toxcatl, one of the most important celebrations in the Aztec calendar, honoring Huitzilopochtli, a huge gathering of Aztec nobles, priests, and performers assembled in the great ceremonial precinct. They were unarmed. They were dancing. Alvarado ordered an attack. His soldiers moved into the precinct and slaughtered the assembled nobles. The reasons Alvarado gave were that he had intelligence of a planned uprising. Most historians believe he panicked, or that he acted from greed, to seize the extraordinary wealth of jewelry and regalia being worn by the performers. Whatever the reason, the massacre was unprovoked and indiscriminate. The Aztecs rose. The garrison was besieged in its palace. When Cortés returned, having brilliantly absorbed the forces sent against him, he fought his way back into the city, but the situation was now beyond repair. The streets were hostile. The canals were controlled by Aztec warriors. Moctezuma, forced to appear on the palace roof and plead for calm, was met with stones and arrows from his own people. He was struck. He died within days, his death attributed either to wounds from his own subjects or, in some Spanish accounts, to being killed by the Spanish when he was no longer useful. Both versions are possible. Both are horrifying. With Moctezuma dead, the Aztecs elected a new king, first Huitzilopochtli, then after a smallpox epidemic killed Huitzilopochtli within months, the brilliant and tragic Cuauhtémoc. Cortés made his decision. They must flee. In the dead of night on the last day of June, 1520, the Spanish and their allies attempted to escape Tenochtitlan across the Western Causeway, carrying as much gold and treasure as they could. They had a portable bridge to cross the breaks in the causeway where the bridges had been removed. They were discovered. From the darkness of the lake came the war canoes. From the city came the warriors. The causeway, packed with soldiers and Tlaxcalan allies and horses and cannons and treasure, became a killing ground. The portable bridge became stuck and could not be moved. Men fell into the water, dragged down by the weight of gold they refused to abandon. Horses screamed. Soldiers were captured and hauled away for sacrifice. The causeway ran red. By morning, Cortés had lost perhaps a third to half of his Spanish force and thousands of Tlaxcalan allies. He sat beneath a tree on the mainland shore. The Tree of Sorrows, the Spaniards called it, and you can visit a descendant of it in Mexico City today, and wept. The Spanish called that night La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. The Aztecs had won, and yet, and here is one of the great tragic ironies of this entire story, the Aztecs had already lost, because on the boats that had brought the Spanish to Mexico, there had been something invisible, something that had no name in Nahuatl, something against which no warrior or priest or sacrifice could protect. Smallpox, the disease swept through the Valley of Mexico with terrifying speed. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had no immunity to the diseases of Europe, no exposure, no evolved resistance. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, all of these began killing in catastrophic waves. Some estimates suggest that the population of central Mexico fell by 50 to 90% over the century following contact with Europeans. Millions upon millions of people. Cuitlahuac, the king who had led the victorious resistance, died of smallpox within 80 days of taking the throne. The priests who might have organized a spiritual response died. The farmers who might have fed the defenders died. The warriors who might have fought on the causeways died. The Aztec world was already dying from within. Cortés simply had to be the instrument of the final blow. Cortés spent the months after the Noche Triste reorganizing, recruiting, and preparing. He was not beaten. He was never beaten. That was his remarkable quality. He returned to Tlaxcala, where his allies, furious at the Aztec resistance and their own losses, but still committed to the destruction of Aztec power, welcomed him. He sent to the coast for reinforcements and supplies. He recruited from the allied cities that had watched the Spanish suffer and calculated that they might still be on the winning side. He had the extraordinary logistical insight to have brigantines, small armed sailing vessels, constructed in pieces, carried over the mountains by 10,000 porters, and reassembled on the lakeshore. The new Aztec king was Cuauhtémoc, descending eagle. He was young, perhaps 25, and he understood with terrible clarity what was coming. He organized the defense of Tenochtitlan with everything available to him. He extended and deepened the canals. He reinforced the causeways with barricades and traps. He organized his warriors into units dedicated to defending different sectors of the city. He sent diplomats to the other cities of the valley, urging resistance, offering alliance. Some responded, many did not. They had already decided that the Aztecs would fall and that survival meant accommodation with the Spanish. In May of 1521, Cortés began the siege. The Spanish controlled the lake with their brigantines. The Aztec canoes, formidable in numbers, could not overcome the firepower and size of the Spanish vessels. Cortés divided his forces into 3 columns, attacking along the 3 main causeways, north, south, and west, while the fleet cut off resupply by water. The city was surrounded. What followed was 75 days of the most brutal urban warfare imaginable. The Aztec defenders fought with ferocious skill and bravery. Every canal became a killing zone. Every rooftop became a platform for attacks with stones, javelins, and obsidian-edged weapons. The Spanish would advance along a causeway, only to find gaps in it that they had to fill before horses could cross. Aztec warriors waiting on the flanks in canoes would then attack from the water. Spanish soldiers were taken alive, and from the great temple, which the defenders still held, the watching Allied warriors and Spanish could hear the drums and see the silhouettes of the sacrificed against the firelight. Cortés was nearly captured. Bernal Diaz describes moments of absolute chaos, Spanish soldiers fleeing with Aztec warriors on their heels, the causeways slick with blood. Again and again, the Spanish advanced and were pushed back, but the Aztecs were dying. The siege cut off the food supply. The chinampas were captured or abandoned. The aqueducts were severed. Fresh water stopped flowing. The people of Tenochtitlan drank from canals contaminated by the dead. They ate the bark of trees. They boiled leather. They starved. And smallpox continued its invisible massacre. The city that had been one of the great wonders of the world was being destroyed block by block. Cortés ordered the systematic demolition of every building the Spanish captured, filled the canals with rubble, leveled the houses, so that the Aztec defenders could not retake them. The beautiful city was being fed into its own destruction, building by building, canal by canal. Cuauhtémoc fought on. He organized a final counter-offensive that caught the Spanish by surprise. For one burning day, he pushed them back, captured dozens of Spanish soldiers who were sacrificed on the temple steps, and came close to breaking the siege. Cortés rallied his forces. The moment passed. As the circle of destruction closed around the heart of the city, Cuauhtémoc attempted to escape by canoe with his family and a small group of nobles. A Spanish brigantine gave chase. He was caught on the lake. When they brought him before Cortés, he reportedly reached toward the dagger on the Spaniard's belt and said, or tradition records him as saying, something to the effect that, "I have done everything I could to defend my people. Take that knife and kill me." Cortés did not kill him, not yet. He would eventually have Cuauhtémoc tortured, his feet burned, in an attempt to find hidden gold. And years later, on a march through the jungle of Honduras, for reasons that remain murky, he had Cuauhtémoc hanged. But in that moment on the lake, Cuauhtémoc was taken alive. The date was the 13th of August, 1521. A day the Aztecs would have read as one serpent in their sacred calendar. A day their priests might have seen as ominous or perhaps as inevitable. Tenochtitlan fell. What remained of the city, and there was very little, fell silent. The survivors, gaunt with starvation, covered in sores, their priests dead and their gods seemingly abandoned, walked out of the rubble. Bernal Diaz, who was there, wrote that the streets, the canals, the very lake were full of the dead. that the stench was unbearable, that the survivors were so wasted and hollow-eyed they seemed like ghosts. The greatest city in the Americas lay in ruins, and on its foundations the Spanish began to build another city, Mexico City, capital of New Spain. The Spanish dumped rubble into the canals, filled the lake, leveled the temples, and used their stones for churches. The Templo Mayor was buried under the central square, the Zocalo, of the new colonial capital. It would not be rediscovered in its full extent until 1978, when workers digging to lay electrical cables struck the great stone of the goddess Coyolxauhqui. The Aztec world was gone. Or was it? It is tempting, when we reach the fall of Tenochtitlan, to close the book. To say, the empire fell in 1521, the culture was destroyed, the story ended. But that is not quite right. What the Spanish conquered was a political structure. The Triple Alliance, the tribute system, the Tlatoani, and his court. What they could not conquer so easily was a people, a language, a living memory. In the decades after the conquest, an extraordinary thing happened. Aztec and Spanish scholars worked together, sometimes with genuine collaboration, sometimes under the pressure of colonial power, to record as much as possible of the world that had existed before. The most remarkable figure in this effort was a Franciscan friar named Bernardino de Sahagún. Sahagún spent decades working with Aztec informants, elders, priests, scholars who remembered, to compile an encyclopedic record of Aztec culture. The result was the Florentine Codex, 12 volumes covering everything from the nature of the gods to the properties of medicinal plants, from the cycle of festivals to the occupations of craftsmen. It is the single most important source we have for understanding the world of the Mexica. Sahagún himself was paradoxical, a man devoted to Christianity who nevertheless preserved with extraordinary care the very culture he was helping to dismantle. Other codices were created or copied from surviving originals. Aztec nobles and intellectuals learned the Latin alphabet and used it to write down histories, genealogies, and poems in their own Nahuatl. Some of this was done in service of colonial power, proving noble lineage, justifying land claims. But some of it was simply the human need to remember, to say, we were here, we built something, we knew things. In Texcoco, scholars compiled and preserved much of the philosophical and poetic tradition of Nezahualcóyotl. In Tlatelolco, a generation of young Aztec men trained by the friars became scholars, writing in Nahuatl and Spanish with equal fluency, navigating two worlds. The Nahuatl language survived the conquest. It is still spoken today by over 1 million people in Mexico and Central America. It is a living language, bearing within it the structures and memories of a civilization that has been declared dead for 500 years. The food survived. The corn survived. The tomato, the chili, the chocolate, the avocado, all of these things, domesticated and perfected over thousands of years in Mesoamerica, spread around the world after contact. There is no Italian cuisine without the tomato. There is no Swiss chocolate without the cacao bean. There is no Indian curry without the chili pepper. In this very real and tangible way, the agricultural legacy of the Aztec and their predecessors feeds the world every single day. The gods survived, transformed. The Virgin of Guadalupe, who appeared to a Nahuatl-speaking indigenous man named Juan Diego in 1531 on a hill just outside Mexico City, appeared on the very spot where the goddess Tonantzin had been worshipped before. Was this coincidence? Was it a conscious adaptation? Was it perhaps something the indigenous people themselves managed? A survival strategy, a way of preserving something sacred under a new name? Scholars argue. but the living practice of Mexican Catholicism is saturated with pre-Columbian elements, rhythms, and sensibilities. The bodies survived. The majority of Mexicans today are mestizo, of mixed indigenous and Spanish descent, and carry within their DNA the genetic inheritance of the Mexica, the Tlaxcalan, the Totonac, the Zapotec, and dozens of other peoples of the ancient world. When a Mexican person looks in the mirror, they may see the face of a Toltec, a Mexica, a child of the sun. But let us also be honest about the catastrophe. The conquest and the century that followed it was one of the great disasters in human history. Estimates of the indigenous population of Mexico and Central America before contact range from 15 to 25 million people. By 1600, the population had collapsed to perhaps 2 to 3 million. Most of the dead were killed not by Spanish swords, but by European diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, against which they had no immunity. This was not deliberate biological warfare in the modern sense, but it was a holocaust, a civilization-ending catastrophe beyond anything the Aztec sacrificial theology had imagined. The survivors were subjected to colonial labor systems, the encomienda, the repartimiento, that were little better than slavery in practical terms. Their languages were suppressed in schools, their temples were destroyed, their sacred books, the codices, were burned by zealous priests who saw in their painted pages the work of the devil. Only a handful of pre-conquest codices survive, and most of those were preserved in Europe, taken there as curiosities. Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor, is remembered today in Mexico as a national hero. His image appears on currency. Statues of him stand in public squares. He is the figure of noble resistance, of dignity maintained even in defeat. Hernán Cortés has no national monument in Mexico. He is a complicated figure, brilliant, ruthless, the instrument of both destruction and creation. He fathered with Malintzin one of the first mestizo children of the New Mexico, a son named Martín, sometimes called the first mestizo. Cortés himself died in Spain, in relative obscurity, in 1547, still fighting lawsuits and attempting to regain the favor of the crown. La Malinche, Malintzin, has become one of the most contested figures in Mexican history. She is at once reviled as a traitor and celebrated as a survivor. The word malinchismo in Mexican Spanish means a kind of cultural self-betrayal, a preference for the foreign over the native. But this reading strips her of her humanity and her context. She was a slave. She was given away. She survived, and in surviving, she shaped history. Her full story is one of the most extraordinary and most painful in the entire record of human encounter. And what of the Templo Mayor? It sleeps under the heart of Mexico City. Archaeologists have been excavating it for decades, and every season brings new discoveries. Offerings sealed in stone boxes, the bones of animals sacrificed to the gods, turquoise mosaic masks, the great stone of Coyolxauhqui, the moon goddess defeated by Huitzilopochtli, her dismembered body carved in magnificent bas-relief. The temple is still there. The city grew over it, but could not erase it. Mexico City itself sits in the old lake bed. The ancient city of Tenochtitlan still shapes the geography beneath the streets. Some of the old canals survive as streets. You can walk them today. The great floating gardens of Xochimilco, a short distance from the modern city center, are the last surviving chinampas, still functioning, still producing food on the same ancient system the Mexica used, still tended by people who have been tending them for centuries. The Aztec calendar continues to be used, not officially, not by the state, but in certain communities, in certain traditions. In the ritual practice of the danza conchera, indigenous people in elaborate costumes dance in the Zocalo, the central square of Mexico City, built on the ruins of the sacred precinct, carrying the memory of the gods in their bodies, their feet on the buried stones of the Templo Mayor. The children of the sun are still dancing. We have come a long way together in this story, from the reed islands of mythical Aztlan through the long wandering in the wilderness of Mesoamerica to the muddy island where an eagle perched on a cactus and a god whispered, "Here, build here." We have watched a people transform themselves from nobodies into the masters of an empire. We have marveled at their city rising from the lake, that impossible, beautiful, terrible city. We have heard the drums and smelled the incense and felt the shadow of the pyramids. We have walked the market of Tlatelolco and been stunned by its abundance. We have watched the night sky through the eyes of their astronomers and felt the weight of a universe that could die if it was not fed. And we have watched it end. The causeways choked with fleeing soldiers and the dead, the fires on the temple steps, the last emperor reaching for a dagger and being denied even the dignity of a warrior's death. The silence that fell over the lake on the 13th of August, 1521. What do we make of all this? Of the Aztec civilization presents us with a series of profound challenges to simple moral judgment. This was a world that produced some of the most extraordinary art, poetry, architecture, and scientific knowledge of any civilization in history. This was also a world that practiced large-scale human sacrifice as a central religious rite. Both of these things are true simultaneously. We cannot keep only one and discard the other. There is a temptation, particularly in certain popular histories and spirituality traditions, to romanticize the Aztecs, to focus only on their ecological wisdom, their communal land systems, their extraordinary art, their complex calendar, and edit out the blood. This is a distortion. It does not honor the dead, including those who died on the altars, and it does not honor the Aztecs themselves, who would not have recognized a sanitized version of their own faith. There is an equal temptation, the one that has dominated Western popular imagination since the Spanish themselves, to define the Aztec civilization entirely by its sacrificial practices, to use the blood as a justification for the conquest, a proof that what was destroyed needed to be destroyed. The Spanish themselves used this argument explicitly. We came to save souls from a diabolical religion. This is also a distortion, used to launder the gold and the enslaved labor and the millions of dead from epidemic disease. The truth is harder. The Aztec civilization was a human civilization. It contained human greatness and human horror in a proportion and configuration that was specific to its time, its place, its cosmological understanding. We can admire its poetry without excusing its altars. We can mourn its destruction without pretending it was a paradise. What we cannot do, what we should not do, is forget it, because forgetting is its own kind of violence. When the colonial authorities burned the codices, they were trying to make a people forget who they were. When school curricula in certain parts of the world teach the conquest as a march of progress and civilization, they are completing that erasure. The story of the Aztec civilization is the story of what human beings are capable of, the full range of it. It is the story of what happens when two worlds collide and neither fully understands the other. It is the story of empire and resistance, of beauty and cruelty, of gods who demanded everything. And it is, perhaps most urgently, the story of a city built on a lake, sustained by the labor and faith of its people, that rose to unimaginable heights and then fell in a season of fire and disease and betrayal. a city that the world had never seen before and will never see again. Tenochtitlan, the place where the eagle landed, the place where the fifth sun was fed, the place where, on a cold November morning in 1519, two men met at the center of the world and looked at each other across a gulf wider than the Atlantic and tried and failed to understand. The eagle is still there, on the Mexican flag. The cactus, the serpent, the ancient sign frozen in time, fluttering in the wind over a city built on the ruins of another city, on the bones of a civilization that is not entirely gone, not entirely forgotten. The fifth sun still rises every morning. For now,